used to teach people how to defend Christianity until millions watched him walk away. Now he says that it can't be defended, and he's nearly certain that the resurrection never happened. But if you take a closer look at what he says, something doesn't add up, and it all just starts to fall apart. So Rhett isn't just another massive YouTuber with doubts. He was a full-time missionary who spent years teaching others how to explain and defend their faith. So when someone with that background says that the resurrection didn't happen, it can be a big deal. But as I looked deeper into his claims, especially in his recent interview with Alex O'Connor, something stood out. His arguments didn't just raise objections, they exposed just how shaky his objections to Christianity actually are. Alright, so let's break all of this down. So as we go through the clips, I want you to keep in mind one thing. At the core of Christianity is one central claim, that Jesus died and rose again from the dead for our sins. And if that didn't happen, then Christianity is false. So given that Rhett seems to be familiar with the arguments for the resurrection, it raised a huge question for me. What was his reason for saying that it didn't happen? And when Alex asked him this question, here's what he said.
You know, I don't remember specifically like, okay, well, it was this book, it was that, but you know, it could be something as simple. It was one aspect of that argument, of that case. You know, probably the most famous one is, well, why would the disciples die for a lie? Mm-hmm. And then when I really looked into that, and then I found that, well, I don't think I can actually historically defend that anyone died for something that they knew to be a lie. Like, I think that this can be explained by them being deceived, right? They could just be wrong about what they saw or their perspective.
Okay, so Rhett's suggestion is that the disciples weren't lying, they were just deceived. Or in other words, maybe they were just sincerely wrong about seeing the risen Jesus. Now that's one explanation, just not a very good one. You see, we're not just talking about random eyewitnesses who barely knew Jesus. The disciples lived with him day in and day out for the past 3 years, so they knew his voice, his mannerisms, and his personality. And on top of that, even after the resurrection, they didn't just claim to see him once in passing. They spent several more days talking with them, walking with them, and eating with them. Thomas even touched the holes on Jesus's wrist. So this is not some sort of mild religious impression. It's physical, relational, and hands-on experience. And so, given how well the disciples knew him, it would be an incredibly hard thing for them to get wrong. But there's something else that makes Rhett's reasoning even more problematic. He explained earlier how he trusts scientists on the theory of evolution since it's the best explanation of the available evidence. But that's exactly what Christians are saying when it comes to the resurrection. The idea that Jesus rose from the dead explains the historical facts better than any other theory. Alternative theories tend to rely on extra assumptions or ad hoc reasoning that's not supported by the evidence. Instead, they're built solely to dismiss the resurrection claim, not to make sense of the existing evidence and data. Okay, but next, Rhett doubles down and his reasoning gets even shakier.
What I've learned about the process of historical investigation, and also just the nature of human psychology and the nature of religious movements and the nature of people's willingness to believe things, like, it began to dawn on me that I don't know exactly what happened with Jesus. I don't know the nature of specifically the nature of his death. Like, was he left on the cross? Was he thrown into a large, like mass grave? Was he put into a rich man's grave by Joseph of Arimathea? Was that invented? I don't know. But what seems to be pretty clear to me is that it's almost certain that there's some explanation for how it all started that isn't that he actually raised from the dead.
So Rhett admits that he doesn't know what happened to Jesus, but then says that it's almost certain that Jesus didn't raise from the dead. And in defense of that incredibly strong claim, he gives two vague reasons. The first is human psychology, our tendency to believe what we want to believe. But there's a major problem with that claim. In first century Judaism, no one was expecting a dying and resurrecting Messiah. Resurrection was something that would happen at the end of the world, not to a single person, in the middle of history while Rome was still in power. And wishful thinking only works if people are expecting something to begin with. So the disciples wouldn't have invented this because it fit their expectations. It violated their expectations. For the sake of the argument, we could still grant his claim that sometimes humans believe things without evidence. But just acknowledging that fact is not evidence that that's what happened here. All he's given is an unsupported guess, and that's fine if he wants to guess, but he can't say that Christians don't rely on the evidence while not relying on the evidence himself. His second claim was that he knows how religious groups start. And if so, then he knows that Christianity is the exception, not the rule. The resurrection was preached immediately, in the very city where it allegedly happened, by people who claimed to see Jesus with their own eyes. This was at a time and in a place where people could easily verify if they were lying or not. And it still convinced thousands in a culture that had every reason to reject it. So here's a question. How could Rhett be so certain that Jesus didn't raise from the dead if he can't offer a better explanation and he hasn't even refuted the evidence that Jesus did? Yes, Rhett is right. Blind faith does exist, and pointing to possible explanations that don't have any supporting evidence doesn't prove anything. That's not a refutation, it's a distraction, which perfectly leads into something that Rhett said earlier.
This is a big problem for me now, is to not settle on what I think I figured out, to be really doubtful of my particular perception of the world, to say, well, I know that I'm wrong about some stuff, and there's a lot of stuff that I'm not sure about, but I can struggle with wanting to latch on to certain ideas and be like, well, I've got this figured out, and you start trying to build this worldview.
Okay, honestly, I respect that. That kind of self-awareness is rare, and it's something that's important. Being willing to question your own assumptions is a good thing. But here's the irony. The very issue that Rhett says that he's working on, being too confident in his own views, is exactly what he's doing when he confidently claims that Jesus almost certainly did not rise from the dead. He admits that he doesn't know what happened, but still rules out the resurrection as the one thing he's sure didn't happen. It sounds like he's saying that if the evidence were good enough, then he'd believe it, and that's exactly what makes his next comment all the more confusing.
Even if it did happen, it doesn't feel like a really penetrating investigation into the historical circumstances is what's going to make it click and be like, oh, it did happen. Mm-hmm. I looked under the last rock of history and I found the resurrection. Like, it doesn't seem like God intended for that to be the way. If
that's right.
This is clearly this is a revelation. This is like, this is a secret. This is like God's secret information that you can choose to believe. And then your life is transformed. Like, I'm okay with people who frame it in that way. I'm like, well, I still think that I think this is a psychological phenomenon. I don't believe it. I'm a skeptic in that regard, but I just find it so interesting the way that some of these apologists go so hard on trying to prove it. Mm-hmm. It's like, do you really think that that's gonna be the thing that changes somebody's mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like it's what Jesus was doing.
No,
verily I say unto you, premise one.
Yeah, he wasn't doing apologetics.
It doesn't work like that. It's clearly like not what it's all about.
Okay, so Rhett seems puzzled that people would focus so much on the resurrection as if trying to prove it misses the point. But there's a few major issues here. First, the resurrection is the point. It's not a side note or a bonus belief. It's the very foundation of Christianity. Because as Paul said, if Christ has not been raised, then our faith is in vain and we're to be pitied above all men. That's why Christians care so much about whether or not it happened, because if it didn't, then we're just wasting our time. Second, when him and Alex claimed that it wasn't an apologetic, that's also false. The resurrection is the reason why we know that Jesus is who he claimed to be. It's not just theology, it's also evidence. A real physical event in history that validates his message, and that's why the apostles emphasized this so much. It wasn't a secret revelation, it was a public claim based on eyewitness testimony. And third, Rhett seems to think that it's strange that this evidence can actually persuade someone, but that's exactly what it did for me and several other people that I know. It's actually what led me to fully embrace Christianity. Now, it is true that not everyone looks at the intellectual reasons or the facts for their faith, but for those of us that do, the facts were actually a big part of why we landed on Christianity during our truth-seeking journeys. So, no, up until this point, Rhett has not given us a good reason to reject the resurrection. But next, he brings up an argument that he believes should make us doubt it by pointing to Mormonism.
I ended up writing this like pamphlet. I would do this all the time. I would write like little papers or pamphlets or whatever. And there was one that was like, this is what you need to say the next time the Mormons come to your door, right? Because you can take apart their theology and their history in a much, it's so recent, right? So that was my perspective. And I find it so interesting that the average Christian apologist, the level of scrutiny they apply to criticizing Mormonism, if they would just for a moment turn that level of scrutiny on their own story, you'd be like, guys, come on, do you see what you're doing?
So Rhett says that if Christians applied the same level of scrutiny to the resurrection that they apply to Mormonism, then they'd realize just how shaky their story really is. And Alex backed Rhett up on this.
You're right about the double standard as well. I just had a Mormon on my show, Jacob Hansen, and he can kind of like hold up a mirror to these Christians because they look at him and be like, oh yeah, so like, you know, God spoke to some dude in upstate New York through some like golden plates that like no one's ever seen, you know, and he's like, yeah, well, how many witnesses do you have to the resurrection that left any accounts?
Right.
Like, we've got more eyewitness testimony to the golden plates than you've got to the resurrection, you know?
Okay, now to be fair, we all have biases. It's incredibly easy for us to scrutinize other worldviews more harshly than our own. But in this case, this is not one of those times. Here's why. Let's apply the same scrutiny to the eyewitness testimonies of both events, and for the sake of the argument, we can even still man both positions and assume that they're both true. So the Mormon witnesses say that they saw these gigantic plates, which were supposedly the source for the Book of Mormon. They claim to see these plates with quote-unquote spiritual eyes, and these plates were supposedly written in Reformed Egyptian, which is a language that doesn't have any linguistic or archaeological support for its existence. So these witnesses couldn't read the plates, and Joseph Smith couldn't either, which is why he claimed to translate them by putting a seer stone and his face into a hat and allegedly had his scribes write it down. And even more, according to witnesses like his wife Emma Smith and David Whitmer, Joseph didn't even look at the plates while he was dictating what they allegedly said. So think about what we have here. The best eyewitnesses testify that they saw some plates that they couldn't read and in a spiritual sense. But none of that means that the translation or the Book of Mormon's story is true. In fact, most of the central claims in the Book of Mormon seem to be demonstrably false. No archaeological site, artifact, or inscription has been conclusively linked to any specific person, place, or event described in the Book of Mormon. And unlike the Bible, which has some corroborating archaeological evidence for places and people, the Book of Mormon's cities, battles, and civilizations remain unverified in the archaeological record. Okay, now contrast that with the eyewitnesses of the resurrection. The disciples weren't reporting a vision or a spiritual impression. They saw something that everybody else could see as well. They said they saw Jesus, talked with them, ate with them, touched his wounds. And if that testimony is true, that's not just a claim, it's a direct confirmation of Christianity's central truth. So when Rhett and Alex say that Christians are being inconsistent, it's really the opposite. The eyewitness testimony of the golden plates simply doesn't confirm the truth of Mormonism, but the eyewitness testimony of the resurrection does confirm the truth of Christianity. So what can we take away from this? Well, Rhett walked away from Christianity because he became convinced that the Bible wasn't true and that the resurrection didn't happen. But here's the thing, the more that you examine the evidence, the less his conclusion seems to hold up. He didn't offer a better explanation that accounts for all of the historical facts that virtually all historians agree on, whether they're Christian or not, and I didn't see any reason to believe that he's able to. But Rhett is right that the resurrection isn't just a historical event to only be debated. It's historical evidence of a hope beyond anything that this world offers, because if Jesus really did rise from the dead, then that changes everything. It means sin has been defeated. It means death isn't the end. It means the one thing that we can't fix, our brokenness, our guilt, our separation from God, our death, has already been dealt with. And not by our effort, not by blind faith, but by a Savior who stepped into history, died in our place, and rose to give us life as a free and undeserved gift. We just have to accept it. And that isn't wishful thinking, and it's not a psychological phenomenon. The invitation isn't to believe in spite of the evidence, but because of the evidence. To trust in the one who didn't just talk about truth, but proved it with an empty tomb. If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment down below letting me know that you did, and hit the like button on your way out, and then check out one of these videos, and I'll see you over there, all right? Thanks for watching.